What if I told you the global economy isn't driven by competition, innovation, or ethics, but by quiet financial warfare? What if every financial crisis you've lived through, from 2008 to today, wasn't just a failure of the system, but part of the system? And what if the real power in the world doesn't belong to presidents or parliaments, but to those who control the flow of money? This isn't a conspiracy, it's financial reality. In this series, we pull back the curtain on how global markets are manipulated, how crises are used as weapons, and how nations, even powerful ones, are quietly losing control over their economies. If you care about sovereignty, freedom, and the future of your country, you need to understand this game. Because once you see how money moves, you'll never see power the same way again. We're talking about power. Who has it? Who controls it? And how money, not morals, decides the fate of economies. Let's start with a truth that makes many uncomfortable. The global economy doesn't run on ethics. It runs on financial control. This might sound cynical, but it's not about being pessimistic, it's about being honest. We live in a world where financial institutions and policymakers don't operate based on textbook ideals or economic justice. They operate based on who controls the money, and even more critically, who controls the flow of capital. Take the United States as a prime example. When the Federal Reserve, arguably the most powerful central bank in the world, raises or lowers interest rates, it doesn't just affect American borrowers. It sends shockwaves through every financial market on the planet. A single decision by the Fed can revalue currencies, drive or drain capital in emerging markets, and shift the strategies of corporations and investors globally. Why? Because control over capital flow is the ultimate power. Economic policies, whether labeled as stimulus, austerity, or reform, often serve as tools of this power. But let's be clear, these tools are not necessarily designed to serve the public good, they're designed to serve stability and dominance in a highly competitive financial hierarchy. Let's break it down a little further. Economists often discuss market efficiency, supply and demand, or fiscal responsibility. These concepts are taught in business schools around the world. But in the real world, the ones calling the shots aren't philosophers of fairness, they're strategists of control. Global markets respond not to ethical choices, but to perceived strength. This is why countries that control financial centers, think the US, the UK, Switzerland, China, have far greater influence than nations with larger populations or even more natural resources. In this system, money isn't just a medium of exchange. It's a weapon. And this weapon doesn't have to be fired. It simply needs to be moved, strategically, precisely, and often without a single law being broken. So, why does this matter? Because when people look at rising inequality, volatile markets, or financial crises, they often ask, why can't we fix this? The reality is, the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as intended. It wasn't built on principles of fairness. It was built on principles of control and leverage. We're not just dealing with economic mechanics, we're dealing with a global chess game, where financial flows are the queens and kings, and everything else, from public policy to media narratives, are just pawns. We uncovered a tough truth: the global economy doesn't operate on ethics, it operates on control. Specifically, control of money and, more importantly, control of its flow. Now let's take that one step further. You've probably heard the saying, a country can print its way out of trouble. In theory, a nation with its own central bank can just create money to pay off debts, fund projects, or stimulate growth. Sounds powerful, right? But here's the reality. Printing money is not power if you've lost control over where that money goes, or what it's worth. Let's make this clear, the ability to issue currency does not automatically grant financial sovereignty. What truly matters is whether that currency retains value and whether the country can manage its capital flows, both inward and outward. Take inflation as an example. If a country prints too much money without the backing of production, trust, or strategic capital flow, inflation surges. The currency loses value, people's savings evaporate, and investors, both domestic and foreign, pull their money out. In that scenario, printing more money is like pouring gasoline on a fire. In other words, if you can't control trust, you can't control value. And without value, your printed money is worthless. Let's zoom out and look at how this plays out globally. Even powerful nations like the United States are deeply concerned with who controls their capital inflows. Why? Because financial dependence is a direct threat to sovereignty. This is exactly why the US places intense scrutiny on foreign investment, especially when it involves tech companies that drive innovation, critical infrastructure like energy grids or telecommunications, and strategic land or real estate that could have national security implications. Foreign capital buying up key American assets isn't just an economic issue. It's a geopolitical threat. That's why there are federal agencies like CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, that have the power to block or reverse deals if they're deemed dangerous to national security. Think about that for a second. Even the most powerful economy in the world recognizes that losing control over capital flow equals losing control over national interest. Now apply that same logic to smaller or less developed countries, ones that don't have a strong currency, global influence, or deep financial markets. When these countries open themselves up to foreign investment without limits, they often find themselves losing control over key sectors, from mining to agriculture, from banks to media. And here's the trap. They often believe that foreign investment means growth. And sometimes, it does. But when capital control is weak, that investment can quickly shift from being a blessing to being a method of soft conquest. So, to recap, it's not enough to have the power to print money. True economic power lies in controlling what that money represents, and where it flows. Without capital sovereignty, monetary sovereignty is an illusion. And perhaps the most dangerous illusion of all, is believing that financial dependence doesn't come with strings attached. We explored how printing money is meaningless without control over capital. In this part, we examine a pattern that's repeated itself throughout modern economic history, a pattern where crisis becomes strategy, and chaos becomes the perfect environment for conquest. Let's unpack one of the most powerful, yet underdiscussed strategies in global finance. Create or capitalize on a financial crisis, then acquire valuable assets for pennies on the dollar. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a financial tactic used time and time again, often in plain sight. And it's devastatingly effective. Let's take two major examples. The 2008 financial crisis in the United States, and the Greek debt crisis in the 2010s. In 2008, the US housing bubble burst, triggering one of the most severe financial meltdowns in modern history. The collapse of major institutions like Lehman Brothers sent shockwaves across global markets. The stock market plunged, credit froze, and millions lost their jobs and homes. But here's the twist. While ordinary Americans suffered, a select group of large financial institutions not only survived, they got stronger. How? Because during the crisis, asset prices, homes, stocks, businesses, were deeply undervalued. And those with access to capital were able to go on a buying spree. While the public was distracted by unemployment numbers and bank bailouts, wealth was being transferred quietly and legally. Some of the biggest financial players didn't just recover, they came out richer, more powerful, and with far more control over assets than they had going in. Now look at Greece. After the 2008 global crisis, Greece found itself drowning in debt. Its public finances collapsed under the weight of structural weaknesses and obligations to foreign creditors. What followed was a brutal period of austerity, public spending slashed, pensions cut, and unemployment soaring. But here's the financial side you don't see in the headlines. As Greece's economy burned, foreign investors moved in, buying ports, airports, energy companies, and public infrastructure at cut-rate prices. In short, Greece lost control of strategic national assets, not through war, not through invasion, but through economic dependency. It's what some economists call soft colonization. What's the common thread? In both cases, a crisis, whether organic or manipulated, creates fear and instability. Capital flees, except for those already holding it. Asset prices collapse. Those with liquidity, patience, and a long-term strategy come in and take control. This isn't just about profit. It's about ownership. And ownership equals power, whether it's of homes, companies, ports, land, or natural resources. So next time there's a financial crisis, ask yourself, who benefits? Who has access to capital when everyone else is forced to sell? And what key assets are being transferred, quietly, from public hands to private control? Financial crises are often presented as unpredictable acts of fate. But the outcomes are highly predictable, and consistently profitable, for those in the know. So far, we've explored how global finance isn't governed by fairness, but by control, and how crises, whether natural or engineered, become strategic opportunities to seize wealth. Now we shift our focus to emerging markets, the so-called developing world, where the stakes are arguably even higher. Why? Because these countries often hold untapped resources, strategic geography, growing populations, and weaker financial defenses. They are fertile ground for both growth and exploitation. Let's get real. Emerging markets are not just growing economies. They are battlegrounds in the modern war for financial dominance. In many of these nations, infrastructure is underdeveloped, debt is rising, institutions are fragile, and access to global capital is uneven. That creates the perfect storm for external actors, whether corporations, hedge funds, or even foreign governments, to step in with a promise. We'll help you develop. We'll invest. We'll stabilize your economy. But there's always a catch. Because once that capital flows in, through loans, investments, or trade deals, so does influence. And if the receiving country loses control of the terms, the flow, or the repayment structure, it doesn't just lose money, it loses sovereignty. Take the example of Africa, where many countries have entered into long-term infrastructure and energy deals with outside powers, often backed by debt. When payments become difficult, countries are forced to renegotiate. And during those renegotiations, ports are leased. Mineral rights are sold. Political decisions start being influenced not by citizens, but by creditors. Or look at South America, where IMF loans in the past have come with strict austerity conditions, cut social services, privatized national industries, open markets to foreign ownership. The result? Short-term relief. Long-term dependency. It's a model that has repeated itself across Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, Central America. The names change, but the pattern stays the same. 1. A country seeks capital to develop. 2. Loans and investments flow in, often without strong local oversight. 3. Debt builds. 4. The shock hits, recession, currency collapse, political unrest. 5. Assets are sold off or privatized to cover losses. 6. Control shifts, slowly but surely, out of national hands. And here's the brutal truth. This isn't just economic strategy. It's modern empire building, done with spreadsheets instead of soldiers. This form of soft power, financial colonization, doesn't rely on invasion or occupation. It relies on contracts, clauses, debt schedules, and currency control. It's a quiet form of dominance, but no less powerful than traditional warfare. The victims? Citizens who lose access to public services, land that's no longer owned by the people, governments forced to prioritize creditor payments over domestic needs. And yet, this cycle continues, because the global system rewards it. Creditors are protected. Debtors are disciplined. And emerging markets? They're stuck navigating between desperately needed development and the risk of losing their economic autonomy. So, what can be done? We'll get there. But before that, we need to confront one more reality. Financial manipulation doesn't always look like exploitation. Sometimes, it looks like help. By now, a clear pattern has emerged: crisis, control, and consolidation. We've seen how nations can lose ownership of their future, not through war or invasion, but through finance. We face the heart of the issue. The real war isn't fought with weapons, it's fought over economic sovereignty. In today's hyperconnected world, money moves faster than governments can react. Markets are global, but policy is national. That's the imbalance. And if a country isn't ready, it can become economically colonized without a single shot being fired. So what does economic sovereignty actually mean? It means the ability of a nation to make its own financial decisions, to choose its monetary policy, control its debt, manage its industries, and regulate its markets, without undue influence from foreign capital, multinational banks, or supranational institutions. This kind of sovereignty is hard to maintain in the current global system. Why? Because global finance doesn't respect borders. But it absolutely exploits weak ones. Let's talk about corruption, often viewed as a domestic issue. But today, corruption isn't just a matter of officials taking bribes or misusing public funds. It's about something far more strategic: the manipulation of national economies from the outside. Foreign corporations buying off regulators to pass laws that favor their interests. Banks lobbying for policies that open up new markets for speculative finance. Offshore accounts used to launder public wealth into private hands. In this game, corrupt individuals aren't just breaking the rules. They're serving as internal agents of external influence. That's why fighting corruption today requires more than prosecuting bad actors. It requires building institutional resilience against global financial manipulation. Think of it like this. Controlling your borders won't protect you if your central bank answers to outside interests. Owning your currency means little if its value is dictated by foreign debt holders. Electing your leaders is hollow if their economic policy is written in Washington, Brussels, or Beijing. True sovereignty means financial independence. But here's the catch: it doesn't mean isolation. In a global economy, no country can go it completely alone. The key is balance, integration without submission. Cooperation without dependency. Investment without manipulation. So how do nations defend themselves? Transparency: shine a light on all financial flows, both public and private. Diversification: rely on multiple partners, not just one creditor or investor. Institutional strength: build legal and regulatory systems that can't be bought or bent. Education: empower citizens to understand what's really happening behind the numbers. And perhaps most importantly, the public must care. Because once financial control is lost, it's incredibly hard to get back. Just ask any country that's sold off its ports, lost control of its energy grid, or become locked into predatory debt cycles. The real cost isn't just economic, it's political, cultural, and generational. We followed a hard truth: the global economy is less about growth and more about control. Financial crises, capital flows, debt traps, they're not just economic events. They're strategic tools. And the real war today? It's for control over economic sovereignty. So now, the question is: what happens next? Can nations push back? Can individuals make a difference in a system that seems too big, too fast, and too entrenched? The answer is yes, but it won't be easy. Let's start with governments. For nations that want to defend their sovereignty, the path forward isn't isolation. It's strategic independence. That means building resilient economies that are not overexposed to foreign capital or dependent on a single source of credit or trade. Here's what that might look like in practice. Strengthening domestic industries, especially those in critical sectors like energy, agriculture, and technology. Investing in education and innovation, so the country's future isn't tied to raw material exports or cheap labor. Establishing sovereign wealth funds, so national resources benefit the public long-term instead of being sold off quickly. Diversifying debt portfolios, so a nation isn't at the mercy of one lender, whether it's the IMF, China's Belt and Road, or Western hedge funds. Regulating foreign ownership of strategic assets, not to block investment, but to ensure that control remains in national hands. But governments can't do this alone. The public has a role too. Economic literacy is one of the most powerful tools a citizen can have. Because once people understand how money moves, how markets work, and how control is exercised, they're far less likely to accept narratives that justify corruption, debt dependency, or mass privatization in the name of growth. And for those living in nations already captured by financial interests, there's still hope. We've seen countries renegotiate debt. We've seen legal battles to reclaim stolen public assets. We've seen citizens push back, voting out compromised leaders, resisting exploitative trade deals, and exposing corrupt networks that operate across borders. Technology also offers both a risk and an opportunity. Digital currencies, blockchain, decentralized finance, they all promise a rebalancing of power. But they also open new doors for manipulation, speculation, and surveillance. That's why digital sovereignty will become just as critical as monetary sovereignty in the coming decade. In the end, it comes down to this. Control over money is control over the future. If a country controls its money, it controls its policies. If it controls its policies, it protects its people. And if it protects its people, it preserves its sovereignty. But when control slips, when capital flows are dictated by outsiders, when policies are shaped by creditors, and when the financial system serves the few at the cost of the many, then sovereignty becomes just a flag, not a reality. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. As nations, as leaders, and as individuals, we can continue playing the game on someone else's board. Or we can start designing our own rules. Economic sovereignty in the 21st century won't be given. It has to be claimed, through knowledge, strategy, and collective will. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into global finance, power, and control. If this series opened your eyes, sparked questions, or challenged your assumptions, then we've done our job. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember, follow the money, and you'll find the power.